I was in John Ambrose's talk last week, and like John, I do get a bit carried away when I'm doing a webinar. So if anyone's got questions, unmute yourself and just shout at me. Don't think you're being rude, but there are a couple of our area engagement officers in the chat as well. So they will be able to answer questions, hopefully, as I go on, if you pop them in the chat bit, but I will stop to try and take questions in case anybody's got any as well. So today I'm going to be talking through the Explaining the Gaps project that Link Higher runs, which ties quite nicely into the webinar that is later on with Kelly Noon, who I thought was from Pan Associates, but I think they've changed their name. It's actually Ono. They're going to be doing a webinar around how we better engage cultural minority students and particularly EAL students and the language we use. And it does tie quite nicely with the work we've been doing around the Explaining the Gaps project as well. So hopefully if you are seeing them both, you'll see the overlap between both webinars. Just as an overview, the kind of stuff we're going to cover is there. I'm not going to read it all out. That's just a rough guide as to what I hope to cover from this webinar. What I'm quite keen to try and make sure I don't do is just throw facts out and hit you with loads of information around the project, because it's quite evaluation heavy, quite data heavy. What I'm hoping to do is actually give us some more things to think about as we go into the next academic year with schools and with our activity plans. And also, just sort of as a prelude to later, one of our area engagement officers, John, is doing a session in the Teachers and Advisors Conference for BGU next week. And he's also going to be looking at how we use this data to close the gap, how we put it into context. One thing I will be doing is referring interchangeably to a UniConnect learner and a target learner, and they are in essence the same thing. And we're probably guilty of using them interchangeably quite a lot. So when I refer to a UniConnect learner, I mean a target learner, and when I refer to a target learner, I mean a UniConnect learner. And for those of you who are probably a little bit unsure, and I apologise to those of you who have heard this a million times, but a UniConnect or a target learner is a learner who lives in a postcode within one of our 24 target wards where progression to higher education is lower than expected based on GCSE attainment. So it's quite a complex thing to try and remember. I always find it easiest to put it into context of my own postcode where I grew up. So I was the first in my family to go to university. Nobody else on my street had ever been to higher education. So that, by definition, would have made me a UniConnect student, because as far as my postcode was concerned, students didn't go to higher education. Because I then went to university, my younger brothers wouldn't have been UniConnect, because as far as the data suggests, you go if you grow up on that street. But also because I didn't grow up in one of these 24 wards, regardless of my postcode's background, I still wouldn't have been a target student, because these are the wards where we find higher proportions of these postcodes as identified by the Office for Students. But I won't dwell on that. If anyone has any questions around how we define those learners, just let us know. So a bit of context behind the Explaining the Gaps project, which I think is really helpful. The Explaining the Gaps project isn't run by Link Higher directly, it's run by our evaluation research team, who are based down at the University of Lincoln. And if anybody does have more in-depth questions around explaining the gaps or our data, they are always happy to have a conversation. What I'm hoping today is, because I am not a data person, that I can hopefully make it make sense a little bit more, but they're always happy to have a conversation, and they certainly. So if anybody did want to have a conversation with them, their details are in the individual school reports, or we can pass on your details as well. Some of you might have come across them already. It's Lucy from the evaluation team who leads on explaining the gaps specifically. And I guess the wider context of why we have explaining the gaps is evaluation and research is a key part of what we do on our programme. So some of you will remember previous incarnations of OFS UniConnect or NCOP. Again, we haven't fully got around the rebrand to UniConnect. So what was NCOP? But there's been things like NNCO, there's been aim higher in the past, but there's never really been that burden on evaluating what actually works. So we have these outreach projects to close the gap between learners for social mobility, but there's never really been that emphasis on what works, what's the legacy to all of this. And that's really a key part of what we have to do. And it's something that we hope to remind schools of, that actually we need to evaluate this work so that whenever the funding does finish, at the end of it, we can say, this is what needs to happen if you want to continue to raise aspirations of young people towards higher education. So explaining the gaps is just a part of that. It's not the only thing we do, but explaining the gaps is actually additional work that we choose to do from the collation of the data from our annual baseline survey or CFE Learner Survey, again, an interchangeable term, but it's officially called the CFE Learner Survey. And those of you here in the call who are familiar with the Learner Survey will know what it is, because it's a tedious process that starts in September, lasts a few months, and it's certainly not easy. It's quite burdensome on students as well. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, hope you join us next year in doing it if we run it. But it in essence asks students a series of questions around where they're at, and we're going to go through those questions anyway. But explaining the gaps really helps us drill into that data into more detail. So it's all well and good having this survey, but so what, I guess, is the question we ask through the GAPS project. And the intention, not just of the Explain the GAPS project, but of the Learner Survey, is that we can longitudinally track a student as they engage with Link Higher through their academic journey or academic career, and ultimately to guide this what works approach to outreach activity. And to sort of bring that to life, I won't say it's a state-of-the-art diagram, it just sort of explains the time frame we've used for the CFE Learner Survey. So the baseline survey, and as I said, we often refer to the survey every year as the baseline survey just because it's the terminology we know. But the official baseline was in September 2017. And we had a few thousand responses from students across Lincolnshire, which ultimately told us where Lincolnshire was at against the metrics. Now, when we did wave one in September 2018, we got just shy of 10,000 responses. So at times, our evaluation team would prefer to use that as our baseline. Not just because we had more responses, but also because it's the first year where we've had a full year of actual activity with Link Higher. So it's a better assessment of what's been done. And then we obviously did wave two last September, where we actually had over 10,000. So what I've done is I've put the year groups there to sort of show what I mean by the longitudinal tracking. So year 9, who did the baseline survey in 2017, we can then track again as a year 10 in 2018 and as a year 11 in 2019. To hopefully see if anything we've done has had a positive impact on their learning outcomes and their progress towards accessing higher education. Just a note around wave 3, if you like, which would naturally have been in September 2020. We still don't know if that's going to happen. There are obvious logistical concerns around that. You know, shared computer rooms to try and do the survey are likely to be a no-go. Also ethically, we don't know that CFE, who run the evaluation for the Office for Students, are likely to actually ask us to do the survey in September. Ultimately, it's a wait and see, nothing to worry about right now, a better picture of what's going to happen. Now, when I say around the 10,000 responses as well, that's 10,000 responses after the data has been cleaned by Lucy and the evaluation team. What we mean by that is Lucy would go through the responses and clear out anything that was answered too quickly, answers that had just been straight lined, so tick down the middle, anything that's where it's not been finished, where answers are sort of inconsistent or incoherent, and also if students provide us with what we assume a fake name. So Lincolnshire's Donald Trumps get removed from the survey. So I do apologise if any of our Lincolnshire schools do have a Donald Trump, because their survey won't have counted to the end number. And we'd encourage you to let us know if you've got any Donald Trumps, so that we don't omit them from next year's survey if it happens. So just as an overview, again, I'm not going to go through these questions one by one, but this is what we measure. So this is ultimately the questions we ask and the measurements that we track to see what progress we make across these different metrics. And there's 5 in total. And really what I'm hoping to do by showing you these is it hopefully shows how and why we do the activities that we do, because this is ultimately what we want to see progress in every time we measure learners through the survey. So these are the questions we ask, the questions we address. These are in your individual school reports as well in the back. This is where I pulled them from. So if you do need them for reference, they're there. But you can see that we have 5 categories, and they're the ultimate metrics that we're measuring. And they sort of guide our activities as well. But they're the individual questions that we ask to get our ultimate measurement. And there's certainly, you can certainly look at some of the questions, so that doesn't really measure that thing. So the confidence and resilience, you look at that and go, well, how does that measure confidence and resilience? And it's actually, it's an interesting conversation. And ultimately what we're tasked with doing is finding out what that means. So a low score in confidence and resilience, well, what does that really mean? Because confidence and resilience is quite a broad brush statement. And we can draw in the learner survey to say, well, this is why we've got a low score, and then work out how we address that as well. But we're going to look at these questions in more detail later on anyway, when we look at some of the actual data we found. So in terms of what have we found, and I apologize, this is quite a text-heavy presentation. So this is the last of the webinar series. It's probably the last thing you needed on a Friday. It is quite text-heavy, so I hope I can somewhat bring it to life. The gap provision is one of the main things that we found. So one thing we are starting to see is a closing of the gap between our disadvantaged learners. So I apologise when I said I'd only use UniConnect and target learners. Disadvantaged learners are our target learners from our postcodes. We're seeing a closing of the gap between those learners and non-disadvantaged learners, so those who don't live in our target postcodes. And there are actually occasions where we're starting to see UniConnect learners overtaking learners in their equivalent position, just not from their postcodes, which to some extent implies that what we're doing, the targeted work we're doing, is working. But equally, you know, it's important we don't then leave the non-disadvantaged learners behind. But the disadvantaged learners are there because historically they do progress less into higher education. It's quite important that we do. We are also continuing to identify where the gaps are. So I've labelled this slide, what have we found? But this is sort of an ongoing process. And it's the ongoing process to find, you know, where are UniConnect learners and other target cohorts scoring disproportionately lower in, and consistently so as well, compared to those in similar positions. And why is that? It's all well and good having the data, but the next step is finding out why. And the Explaining the Gaps research goes somewhat to explaining why learners progress less onto higher education. So a year 9 cohort has less confidence than others, so that's why they progress less. But our role really is to understand why they have low confidence and resilience, or why a year 11 cohort doesn't have confidence in their own study skills, and to address that. And that's really important, that we don't just stop and use the research as an explanation for low progression onto higher education. It's that we use it as a starting point to then develop on to look at what activities we need to do to support them. Also, and I was about to use the word interesting, it's interesting definitely to me, is that we are starting to identify year-on-year trends when we look at the surveys. So because we've gone through 3 sets of surveys now, what we're finding is that the scores and the metrics are indicative of being in a year group, not being in that particular cohort of a year group, which probably doesn't sound that different. But in essence, when we measure these students, we're not finding that it's a case of having a good bunch of year 9s or a bad bunch of year 11s or year 13s who have low aspirations. What we're finding is that this is indicative of being in that year group. So it's not a particular cohort, it's actually just being in year 9 or being in year 10. And again, I'll go through that in a little bit more detail as we go through the slides. And I've referred to where we've seen other cohorts scoring disproportionately lower in. And one of those cohorts are students who self-report a disability or students who answer that they prefer not to say around their disability. They are consistently in the lowest quintiles countywide, across all year groups, across all schools, across all areas. And that for us is something that we really want to address in the next academic year, because that's not just this in the most recent survey, that's been year on year that they do score lowest. Now, one of the barriers we have is we don't know who those students are. So they're self-reported disability or preferred not to say. From the surveys, we don't know who these students are. So it's going to require some support from the schools to work with us on that, to really try and find out who these learners are. But what we find is that particularly looking at confidence and resilience, confidence in their ability to study at higher education level in ST skills, and to see the personal benefits of higher education, they are consistently the lowest scoring across all learners in the county. It's quite interesting as well that they don't necessarily score low when we look at application knowledge and participation knowledge. So they understand what it means to progress into higher education, what's required of a student. But when it comes to actually having the confidence to do so, self-belief in their study skills to do so, and understand the personal benefits of higher education, they don't agree. And to some extent, it's the kind of broad question that we have to make, but we could have probably guessed that students who do self-report disability fear that they won't fit in at higher education level. But the Explaining the Gaps research shows that that is definitely the case, but it's now, like I said before, that's the starting point for us. What do we do about it next? So it's all well and good that it explains that, but what now do we need to do to address it? Also, we found is around the localized data trends. So by school, we see the trends, and within your individual school report, we can pull out those trends. And as I mentioned at the start, really encourage you to speak to Lucy at the University of Lincoln if you want a little bit more context and a little bit more detail about the responses that your school's got, because like I said, she really does bring it to life around what the data means for your school. But what we've also worked hard to do, especially this year, is look at the wards trends that we found. So it fits quite nicely into the Confident Choices model, really, because we can actually look at the wards as Confident Choices wards. And what we've done is used our ward trends to guide our what works approach for the next academic year, particularly in the ward plans that we have mentioned in partnership agreements and things like that. But what Lucy did with the survey responses was identified where scores were average, where scores were above average, and where scores were below average for full year groups, so not discriminating on postcode, but also for UniConnect learners across the year groups. And what it's meant we can do is really find those ward averages and those ward trends in an area. Now, what I will also link in the ward and the school reports is we don't share school reports with anybody else but your school, because it could be potentially sensitive. It might not be something that you want to share. But it's certainly come up in conversations before, and probably worthy of consideration and worthy of a conversation within your clusters is whether it is something that you'd like to share, particularly to look at any consistent trends, not on a ward level, because we can do that as Link Higher, but where two schools might both score low in a certain measurement, is there something we can collaborate on? Or where schools in your cluster score higher, why is that? Can we try and learn best practice from that? Sorry, I'm getting loads of messages about the Boris speech, and it's distracting me there. So what we also have is the county-wide data trends. So like I've already talked about, we have the self-reporting a disability data trend. So we can see county-wide that is a problem and something that we need to address. We're also identifying the in the ward plans some of the county-wide data as well. So just looking at the learner, and what I've done here is pulled out some of these ward trends and county trends, just to add a little bit of context about really what are the next steps for us and what have we found from this CFE Learner Survey. So particular application and participation knowledge, there's quite a significant overlap with the kind of questions that they ask. But in application knowledge, in year 9 and 10, UniConnect learners, we find that they score lower and they score below average in terms of their application knowledge to go into higher education. So slightly problematically, we've grouped the wards into 6 rather than the 7 confident choices clusters. We've grouped 2 together. So when I talk about the wards, there's 6 wards here. But in all 6 wards, year 10 learners score below average in terms of their application knowledge in UniConnect learners. So this is exclusively around UniConnect learners. And in 5 of the 6 wards, year 9 UniConnect learners score lower than average. And when you first look at that, you think, oh, that's quite a shock. It means they haven't got the application knowledge that we'd hope for. But what we have to look at is the context around that. Now, the year 9 learners who did the survey will have never had a UniConnect intervention. So we wouldn't expect them to have any great understanding of application knowledge. But also for year 10 learners as well, is have we really delved into these questions? Are these the kind of questions that we've raised with our year 10 or who were year 9 learners the year before? Have we really looked at these as something that we need to do in year 9 and year 10? And the answer is probably not. And actually, we'd be more concerned if older year groups score lower in the application knowledge metrics. And from memory, I think only 1 sixth form cohort out of all 6 wards did score lower than average. So that hopefully is reassuring to some extent. And participation knowledge is almost exactly the same. And across all wards, UniConnect learners from year 11 upwards only actually flagged up twice as being below average. So year 11, 12 and 13s across 6 wards only twice showed that they didn't really have the participation knowledge that we'd hoped for. Also, across 2 of the wards, nobody scored. There was never a negative response across all year groups. So again, it's just around adding that context, but they're the sort of ward trends that we're seeing for those 2 metrics. Then in the others, I think confidence and resilience is always a really interesting one, because confidence and resilience is quite a broad brush phrase that we use. What is confidence and resilience? And they're the questions we use to measure it. And again, I think as we'd probably expect, year 10 and 11 learners answer the lowest of all of our year groups. And that fits the narrative that when you get to year 10 and year 11, you do start to lose a little bit of that self-belief. You start to go into exam mode. So there's probably a little bit more doubt around your academic ability and getting the grades you might need. Again, that's fine. It gives us that explanation that they have lower confidence and resilience in year 10 and 11. But what do we do about it next? And that's sort of guiding this presentation is, that's fine, that's what we found, but we now need to address that within schools. So again, in 4 of the 6 wards, year 10 learners showed as having low confidence and resilience in their UniConnect learner cohort, and the same in 3 out of the 6 year 11 cohorts. What I will say, I know this is just UniConnect specific, but we do have the data from a full year group level as well. So we can actually go into that on the ward level or on the school level to say that as a year group, this is where we're at. And again, I think study skills, I've tried to put the year 9 cohort in again, just to provide that context, because 5 of the 6 cohorts of UniConnect learners scored lower than other year groups and other students in Lincolnshire. But again, that's what we'd expect, because we wouldn't expect a year 9 student doing a survey in September. So they've had year 7 and 8 as full academic years. to have actually really developed these skills to a great extent. And from a UniConnect Link Hire perspective, we don't really start looking at study skills as something to address until year 10 and 11. So again, we'd expect that to be a lower score. And that is reflected in the data. Only one year cohort of the 6 actually scores low. So 5 of the 6 year 11 cohorts across the county actually scored average or above average for study skills, which is reassuring because that's what we'd hope to see when we get to year 11. And then personal benefits of higher education, again, fitting the narrative. Year 9 UniConnect learners scored the lowest, but that certainly can be explained by the fact they've had no interventions. They probably haven't had that real higher education specific guidance and advice. But 2 wards actually across the county showed only positive results across all year groups, that every single year group in 2 out of the 6 wards had positive results only across all year groups. So actually, we can find that personal benefits of higher education in certain wards is already quite high. And as I've said, I've been going through this. This is really to provide us with some context around what we need to do next. So it's all well and good having this data, and we can find these trends, but it's ultimately down to us on the ground with your area engagement officer and with the school to drill into this data and find out what is it we need to do next to support learners on this. So what are we doing next with the data? These are just sort of 4 things that we're doing. It's not exhaustive, it's not limited to what we're doing. There's quite a lot going on around the data and around what we need to do. But ultimately, to continue to really address the gaps and to support the learners who need the support most, we need to use this data with you as schools to guide our activity planning and to really drill into the gaps that we've got. We want to better understand in schools and in colleges why we have high scores and why we also have low scores. So again, it's around, this is a starting point, but what's the explanation for it? It goes back to that understanding that the Explaining the Gaps research shows us why a learner might not want to go into higher education, but we actually want to find out why they're feeling that way and why they've answered in that way. So what we have done is we've developed a series of ward plans that hopefully some of you have seen that terminology used in your partnership agreements that have been sent, and that is a plug for you to look out for your partnership agreements if you haven't opened them already. But the ward plans have been developed for our Hub Plus and Hub Target schools. And Link Hire have always had a core program of activity, a core plan, but it's always been Lincolnshire wide. So it's the same core plan for all schools in Lincolnshire. And the area engagement officers and myself have certainly looked at that and said, well, if we want to have a greater emphasis on this evaluation and on this explaining the gaps research, that doesn't really make sense because that neglects this idea that each ward has its own barriers, its own challenges to going on to higher education. So we've tried to reflect that and to show that we understand as well that a student out on the coast has a very different barrier to progressing to higher education as a student who's grown up in inner city Lincoln, who also have a very different barriers to those who have grown up in the south of the county. So we have these bespoke ward plans that have been designed for our Hub Plus and Hub Target schools in Lincolnshire. And we've used the gaps data to guide this, so to find the gaps in these wards for the students' activity plans. And I think what's really guided this, and it's, again, a sentiment I think is echoed by the Confident Choices framework anyway, is a student who grows up in these wards, it doesn't really matter what school they're from. And that's not a general rule. There are certain trends where actually going to certain schools has a different impact. But as general guidance, living in those wards means you have these barriers. It's not a case of, I live in this ward, but I go to this school, so I don't have that barrier. Actually, we're finding that a Boston student is a Boston student, regardless where you go to study and regardless what your plans are. Actually, this is a Boston problem, or this is a Lincoln problem, or an East Lindsey problem. So we've used that data to guide these plans. So when we present these plans, these aren't sort of things we've just plucked out, this is what we want to do. These have been quite carefully sculpted to actually address the gaps in the areas that your school sits in. What we've also done though is not just use the negative results to guide those plans, because that certainly feels like a patchwork approach. Put a plaster on it and that'll deal with it. We've also used the positive results to guide our plans as well. So what must we do and what must continue based on our positive results? So where we have good results in our areas that suggest what's been happening is working, we've tried to carry that forward as well, and we've tried to include that in the plans. What I will say is, particularly hub target schools, there will be that opportunity to add the school-specific resource as well. So there will be additional support for those additional target groups of students to really support them and to have a more meaningful impact. Now, the progression framework, you might have heard us bandy this term around last academic year. Progression framework for us it's a requirement from the Office for Students. We need to have one. I think if we were being critical on ourselves, we haven't used it to full effect, and we've sort of redesigned that for next academic year. But in short, progression framework identifies what activities address which gaps. So what gaps have we found? What can we do about it? And we'll use the progression framework next year to really identify any additional target activities we need to do in schools. So a particular school that's showing low confidence in their learners, what activities actually address that. But also what the progression framework does is shows the importance of, in UniConnect language, what sustainable and progressive intervention is. And we are required to do sustainable and progressive interventions. What that stemmed from is the evaluation of the first phase of the project when we were NCOP. And the evaluation essentially tells us that one-offs don't work. So doing a one-off activity won't really have a meaningful and effective impact to addressing the gaps we've identified. So if we're showing low confidence in a particular cohort, one activity to address that won't really show in the long term. It might show an immediate impact, but in the long run, it won't have the impact we need. So we need to demonstrate sustainable and progressive interventions. And that's what the progression framework does for us. That is something, again, that I don't want anyone to go away and worry about. It's something that we'll be doing in the background and we'll hopefully present to you as we head into the next academic year. I said that a link hire presentation is the same without shameless plug, and the online program to some extent is that. Obviously, we have the new link hire online learning platform program, which we've quite carefully made sure is available to all of our Lincolnshire secondary schools and colleges. So it's not just for a certain tier of school, it's available to everyone, and it's somewhat different to what we can do with in-school activity. We can have year 8s on the platform as well, and we are looking into how we get year 7s on there also. But I think what I want to be quite careful with when I talk about the online program is we didn't just pull the program out of midair. It wasn't something we just said, oh, this looks fun and this looks like something we want on there. We also actually mapped all of our activities against the same learning outcomes we have from the project. So all of the activities have been designed to actually address some of the gaps we've already identified. And I think a really unique and beneficial feature of the online program is we can target activities where they need to be targeted. So if we find we have a cohort of learners who really struggle with study skills, we can focus a study skills activity to just those learners, and we can do that within the online learning program. Now, the online program is a webinar in itself, and I don't doubt that when we continue this series in September, that the online program will be a webinar on how best to use it, how can we embed it into the school in the next academic year, because we certainly think it's going to be a great resource, particularly as we expect no face-to-face delivery, certainly at the start of the academic year, whereas this will enable us to have that online delivery element. So please get in touch with us for any more information, or speak to your officer about how actually we're going to best use that in the next academic year. But I think the point I want to make is that it is also mapped against these learning outcomes, and it is aligned to the data we have. And then we have target activities next year. And again, it's terminology that I hope some of you have seen is referred to as level 2 data. It's outlined in the partnership with data sharing agreements, but we're really looking to try and get level 2 data from schools. So as always, as a bare minimum, we're going to require what we call level 1 data, and that's students' names, students' postcodes, legal gender, date of birth, and that's what we collect anyway. But what we're really hoping to do is start collecting level 2 data from schools, and that covers things around where there are pockets of BAME students, students on free school meals, students from a service family background, any looked after children, all sorts of different metrics, which will ultimately help us to identify additional target groups of students. And that's there for 2 reasons. It will help us to focus resource into groups of students who we know most need it, but it will also help us to evaluate our activities to a much greater level. So similar to the way that we found that students with self-reported disability do have a lower confidence, they don't see the personal benefits of higher education. We want to be able to do the same for additional target groups of students as well, really about this legacy of Link Higher and of UniConnect. And it will allow us to focus that resource into those groups of students. Also, our partners, our colleges and universities, through the Office for Students as well, have to target underrepresented groups, particularly in accessing higher education. So if we can identify these pockets of students, we also might be able to identify additional opportunities for activity and also possibly opportunities for additional funding from our partners. So certainly a common theme across all of our partners is that they do need to improve access for BAME students. If we've got pockets of these students in Lincolnshire, we want to be able to find them so that we can get them that additional support from our partners as well. Again, that's a real snapshot of what we're doing. That's not all we're doing with the evaluation, and the Explaining the Gaps project is a part of the wider evaluation. We have a series of case study schools, some are in the call, who are being evaluated on an activity level to try and find out where activities have the greatest impact, and we'll also be evaluating award plans to see which combination of activities has the greatest impact. So this is just an element of what we're doing, but hopefully it provides a snapshot of actually what we are doing with data, and to show that it's not just sat there, and that the baseline survey and the Wave 1 survey and Wave 2 survey and the effort that goes into doing it is meaningful, because it means we can really drill into things like this. Now, I'm conscious this has been content heavy, and the NARUPI framework is also quite data heavy and content heavy. So I'm not going to dwell on this for too long, because having also seen John's presentation for the Teaching Advisor Conference next week, is much better than I can bring NARUPI to life. So if anyone's interested in NARUPI, I'd definitely say join John's session next week. But the NARUPI framework ultimately is a theoretical framework that we use to guide our activities. You can see how they broadly align to the questions from the survey we do, but the evaluation, and it's led by the NARUPI framework, is designed by the University of Bath, or University of Bath, depending where you're from in the county, to show us what we need to do, what we need to address to not just help a young person to make an informed decision about going to higher education, but also to effectively progress into higher education, to handle that transition and also sustain that level of study. So NARUPI is not just around getting them there, getting the numbers into higher education. It's really about preparing students, developing their skills to make sure that they're a successful higher education student. And ultimately, any activity we do will align to NARUPI. So we won't fund or support activities that don't align to the NARUPI framework, because that's what guides us in terms of what will make a difference, what will have an impact, and what will address those gaps that we found from the learner survey. So just some examples, and it's not an exhaustive list, it's not extensive, of the kind of stuff that we do against the NARUPI framework. And I think as well, it's quite important that it's not like the Gatsby benchmarks in that this is around every single year group. We must meet this. Narupi A to E is designed to spread over a student's lifespan over their academic journey. So we don't have to address A to E in an academic year. That's not what Narupi is designed to do. The concept behind it is that providing they have sustained and progressive interventions around each of these across their year 9 to 13 journey, that they will be prepared. So I know that's quite Narupi is complicated. It's not easy to get our heads around. And I think we're still sort of on that journey ourselves. But I guess in practice, if we didn't want to in year 9 develop student study skills, we wouldn't have to. We can wait until year 10 and 11 when it's most appropriate. And we can do that across the board. Similarly, if we wait until year 13 to develop students' knowledge and awareness of the benefits of higher education, it's too late. We've missed the boat. So that's in a snapshot how Narupi works. I know that's not extensive, and Narupi is also possibly a webinar in itself. I would say if you've got questions around Narupi, get in touch. The chances are we'll signpost you to the evaluation team as well. But definitely happy to answer any more questions on Narupi in greater detail. Which brings me on to John's conference, another shameless plug. If you are interested in finding out more, there is another conference next week hosted by BGU for teachers and advisors. This is the full program, so there might be things there that actually you're also interested in, but I just thought it was worth sharing because John is also going to, I think, go into a lot more detail around how we work on these gaps and how we put them into context and how we actually close that gap. So I think really I've given you a snapshot of what the project's about, what we've found and what we're hoping to do with it, whereas John's going to give you that real on the ground idea of what we do and how we can work together to do that. We also have our friend Tracy doing a talk on career mark and what it's like to be a leader with confident choices. So there's a lot of overlaps there if anyone's interested. The booking form is there, but I think if you type BGU Teaching Advisor Conference, you'll find the booking form as well. But when this presentation goes out, the booking form is on this slide. So if you are interested, definitely have a look at that. And then that's me really for this one. So happy to take questions. I will stop sharing in a second. But also, obviously, the next session from Ono or Pan Associates from Kelly, it's brilliant. I had the chance to do a pilot training session last academic year in Boston with them, and it certainly gets you thinking around how we work with certainly cultural minority students. And like I said, it has some real overlaps with the work that we're doing around target groups and how we need to better work with them. So if you've got the time after this one, definitely encourage you to jump onto that webinar as well. What I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to come back onto camera, mainly because I've actually done my hair today. You're in an elusive group of people who see me with my hair properly done. So I want to flaunt it, and I'll take questions if we've got it. None yet. It must be because it's such an overwhelming overview of the Explain the Gaps project. But I will say, if anybody does have questions on a school level, please do ask. I think the individual school reports are the fruits of your labour, if you like. A lot of work goes into doing these surveys, and we can't thank you enough. We know how difficult it is. It's that they're a chore. So do try and take some time to look at those individual reports, because that is essentially what it's all for. And we can hopefully sit down with you and look at those reports. We normally, in a normal situation, would be able to do that and really look at you around your activity plans, but given the circumstances, that's a lot more difficult. But definitely, yeah, if you do want some more information around your individual school reports, then yeah, speak to engagement officer, speak to Lucy at University of Lincoln, or get in touch with me as well. I think on a cluster level, we can certainly look at this ward data on a ward level, if that's helpful to clusters looking at what they want to achieve in the next academic year. There's certainly a barrage of questions. I think I've certainly got one eye on time, because I know that if people are joining the session, you are likely to want to have a little bit of a break. So I'm happy to stay on, but happy for people to jump off if they haven't got questions. I'll hold on for a few more minutes, but certainly thank you for joining the call. It's not the most exciting one, I know, when it comes to evaluation, but hopefully you found it useful. Hope you all have a good break, and we'll see you very soon.